Okay, segueing from the self and the other, we're going to take a look at one of Anna Swir's poems. This one's called As I Need Air. In the previous video, we talked about how a lot of times in these poems, the self is identifying with the other in an empathetic way. And some of Anna Swir's poems, especially in the first part, the poems from the book Fat Like the Sun, she's a little bit, maybe antagonistic is not quite the best word because it suggests that she's starting it in a way. I think that she's antagonistic against the other because the other has been antagonistic towards her. If you do a little bit of research about her life, grew up in turmoil, war, I believe, and then it seems like the gender politics were a little bit oppressive where she was living at the time. So those are things that start to come out in the poetry. So I'll read the poem, we'll talk a little bit about it, and what I think the poem is doing and what it's trying to suggest. So, As I Need Air. I shall defile my body, which you have loved. I need to live, as I need air. I shall defile you in defiling my body. It's impossible to love someone defiled. I shall be saved. So, here's a moment where I wish we had like a face-to-face class that I could just throw it out to you guys and see what you all think, because it's kind of a provocative idea that she's going to, in a way, to destroy the other, she has to destroy the self, or the image of the self. And when I think about this, I thought about the word reappropriation. Have you ever heard of that before? And it's where maybe a group of people, it could be an individual, but a group of people typically take an offensive term or idea or whatever, image, something like that, and they use it in a way contradictory to the way that it was originally used, right? So I did some Googling, I found this little passage, this is a little bit more like sociological, but it casts some interesting insight on what we're talking about. So if you can look at the highlighted stuff, if you can read it, I don't know, maybe not. But one argument in favor of this particular reappropriation, which is talking about language when it comes to racial slurs, one argument in favor of this particular reappropriation is that, quote, the more a black person uses the N-word, the less offensive it becomes, end of quote. They claim that they are, quote, cleansing the words of its negative connotations so that racists can no longer use it to hurt blacks, end of quote. That is, self-labeling diffuses the impact of derisive terms by making the name more commonplace. Another example would be the emergence in the 1990s of, quote, queer as a self-label for proud gay men and lesbians, a label that previously had been a deliberate and resented epithet. So not quite what's going on here, but I think that there is a reappropriation. She's not reappropriating a term, she's actually reappropriating her own body. So she's using her body in a different way than the other originally intended to use the body, right? So I read this in the context of a relationship, right? And it seems like, again, sort of the gender politics are a little bit oppressive, where like women are subservient to men here. And so she is defiling what might be an otherwise beautiful body in a way in order to defile the other. And so even though she, in some way, she's kind of destructing the self, she's actually creating a new self out of that. So she's reappropriating her own body, and by doing that, she's reappropriating, the inner self, the inner image. And so, if we go back, creation is a form of destruction. Maybe we can tie that all in here. It's impossible to love someone defiled. I shall be saved. So in order to, maybe she has to destroy the outer self in order to save the inner self. So I find Anna Swir's poetry to be really interesting. And again, she really confronts the other in a way that's maybe not as empathetic, but you can't solve, every situation doesn't call for a fig leaf, right? Sometimes conflict calls for real conflict. And it's great that James Wright can look back at and empathize with St. Judas, or with Judas in a way, or with the executed murderer, or with the guy that's soliciting him in the street. But there are other situations where that sort of attitude doesn't seem to work. And I think that's kind of where we're getting at with the Anna Swir poems.